It was a cold autumn evening when Lisa and her husband Mark moved into their new home, a beautiful but eerily quiet house on the outskirts of town. The house had been vacant for years, the realtor said, but no one explained why. The price was suspiciously low, but Lisa brushed off her unease. They were excited for a fresh start. The first few nights were peaceful, but the silence of the house was unsettling. There was no creaking, no pipes groaning, just an eerie stillness that pressed in on them. Then, on the fourth night, Lisa heard something. It was around 3 a.m. when she woke up to the faint sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate. She nudged Mark, but he was fast asleep. Heart pounding, she listened closely. The footsteps seemed to be coming from the hallway. Slowly, they crept past their bedroom door. Lisa held her breath. They stopped. Then came the whisper. A low, chilling voice murmured something unintelligible just outside the door. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it was just her imagination. When she finally dared to open them, the room was quiet again. The next morning, Lisa convinced herself it was a dream. She told Mark, but he laughed it off, blaming her overactive imagination. But that night the footsteps returned. This time, Mark heard them too. "Probably just the house settling," he muttered, but his face was pale. The next few days the disturbances grew worse. Lisa would wake up to see their bedroom door slightly open, even though she was certain they had closed it. Objects moved on their own. A chair that had been tucked under the table was now in the middle of the living room. Their dog, Max, refused to enter certain rooms, his fur bristling as he growled at something unseen. One night, Mark set up his phone to record while they slept. The next morning, they hesitated before watching the footage. What they saw made their blood run cold. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the bedroom door creaked open. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light, moved inside. It stood at the foot of their bed for nearly 5 minutes, unmoving, watching. Then, slowly, it drifted out of the room, pulling the door shut behind it. Lisa covered her mouth, her hands trembling. "We have to leave," she whispered. Mark, ever the skeptic, insisted on one more night. He wanted to prove it was just their minds playing tricks. That night, Lisa barely slept. She lay frozen in bed, staring at the door. Then, at 3:07 a.m., the door creaked open. A shadowed figure stepped inside. This time, Lisa saw it with her own eyes. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow, sunken eyes stared at them. It had no mouth, yet Lisa could hear it whispering. The words slithered into her ears, an ancient language that made her head throb. Mark bolted upright, gasping as the figure drifted closer. Then it reached for them. Lisa screamed. The next thing she knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the window. The bedroom door was open, but there was no sign of the figure. Mark sat up beside her, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "We're leaving. Today." They packed in record time, not stopping to explain to the landlord. As they drove away, Lisa glanced at the house one last time. In the upstairs window she saw it. The figure stood there, watching them go. Its whisper followed them all the way down the road, and Lisa thought they'd escaped. They moved into a small apartment in town, hoping to leave the nightmares behind. But even the city's hustle and bustle couldn't shake the lingering terror. The whispers, the shadow, the figure that haunted their every thought. It was as though the house had followed them. For a few weeks, things seemed normal. Mark went back to work, and Lisa tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy by exploring the neighborhood. Yet each night, as the clock struck 3:07 a.m., the same unease settled in. Lisa would wake with a jolt, heart pounding, expecting to hear the faintest sound of footsteps or a shadow looming in the corner of the room. But it never came. Not right away. Then, one evening, Lisa found herself alone at home. Mark had to work late, and she decided to relax with a book on the couch. The apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. That's when she felt it. Something watching her. Her gaze drifted to the hallway. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker. "Mark?" she called, even though she knew he wasn't home. No answer. But the shadows kept shifting. Slowly, impossibly, the air in the apartment grew colder. Lisa wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake the dread creeping up her spine. She turned back to the hallway. A figure stood there, tall and gaunt, just like the one from the house. The figure's face was obscured by the darkness, but Lisa could feel its presence, its weight. She couldn't move. It was as if the air around her had thickened, making it impossible to breathe. Then came the whisper, a low, gravelly sound that seemed to scrape against her very soul. "You didn't leave." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The figure stepped forward, each footfall silent but full of malevolent intent. Lisa tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's hand reached toward her, cold and skeletal. She could feel the ice-cold energy emanating from its touch as it brushed her cheek. Suddenly, she snapped back to reality. The figure was gone. But something was wrong. Lisa's eyes darted around the room, her pulse racing. She knew what she had seen. It hadn't been a hallucination or a trick of the light. The entity had followed her, and now it was here. Frantic, Lisa grabbed her phone and tried calling Mark, but the call wouldn't connect. A message popped up on the screen. Connection lost. Her heart pounded. Desperation clawed at her throat. She fled to the kitchen, seeking refuge in the mundane, the comforting act of opening a drawer. But as her hand brushed over the utensils, she froze. In the corner of her eye, she saw something. A shape in the reflection of the kitchen window. The figure stood behind her. Her breath hitched and she spun around. The figure was no longer in the window. It was right there in the kitchen, just feet away from her, its hollow eyes locked with hers. And then it spoke again, in a voice that scraped at the edges of her sanity. "You didn't leave. You can't leave." Suddenly, Lisa wasn't in her apartment anymore. She was back in the old house, the one she and Mark had fled from. The walls were crumbling, the air thick with mildew and rot. The figure's whisper grew louder, more insistent, reverberating inside her skull. "You were always meant to stay with me." Lisa stumbled backward, heart hammering in her chest. The ground beneath her feet turned to dust, and she was falling into the very depths of the house. She reached out for anything, her fingers brushing against the decaying walls, but it was hopeless. The figure hovered above her, now fully materialized, its hollow eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. Then, just as it reached for her, Lisa woke up, jerking upright, gasping for air. The apartment was silent, but something was different this time. The room was dark, too dark for the hour. The shadows were deeper, and the air felt suffocating. Lisa's hands trembled as she reached for the lamp, but before she could touch the switch, she saw it. The faint outline of a figure standing by the door. And this time, it wasn't just watching her. It was waiting. Lisa screamed. The last thing she heard before the room fell silent again was the whisper. "I told you, you can't leave me." When Mark came home that night, he found the apartment eerily still. Lisa was gone, no sign of a struggle, nothing but an unsettling, suffocating silence that filled every corner of the room. The only thing left behind was her phone, lying on the floor, with one message: "It followed me." But Lisa was never found, and no one ever dared to move into that apartment again. And the disappearance of Lisa remained a mystery. Mark was consumed with grief, but the police had no leads. They scoured the apartment, the neighborhood, even the old house, but there was no sign of Lisa. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Mark tried to move on, but something darker was at work. The silence from the moment Lisa had disappeared was unbearable. But as days turned to weeks, he began to hear things. At first it was faint, just the softest of whispers, barely audible. Mark dismissed it as his mind playing tricks. He was exhausted, racked with worry, and his nights were filled with restless dreams. But the whispers grew louder, clearer. "It didn't leave me." The voice was unmistakable. It was Lisa. Mark shot out of bed, heart pounding, eyes frantically scanning the empty room. He ran through the apartment, tearing open closets, checking behind curtains, but there was nothing. Nothing except the oppressive, suffocating silence. He was alone. But the whispers persisted, and they weren't just at night anymore. They came in the middle of the day, when he was sitting in his office working through the backlog of paperwork. The voice would float in like a cold draft, whispering from the corners, from behind the walls. "Mark." The first time it happened, he thought he was imagining it, but it kept happening over and over. The voice, the whispers, were always there, always just out of sight. He could feel it now. He wasn't alone. The figure, that thing, was still watching him. He'd ignored it for too long, convincing himself it was just grief. But now he understood. It wasn't Lisa he had lost. It was his mind. Or perhaps his very soul. One evening, Mark couldn't take it anymore. He drove to the old house, the one Lisa had fled from. He had to know if it was real, if the whispers had followed him, if the house itself was cursed. The moment he turned onto the familiar street, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The house loomed, dark and decaying, its windows like eyes staring into his soul. He parked the car, heart hammering. The air was thick with dread as he stepped out, each breath turning to ice. The wind picked up, howling like some living thing, as if warning him to stay away. But Mark pressed on. The front door of the house was wide open, almost inviting. He stepped over the threshold, his shoes crunching against the shattered glass and debris that littered the floor. The house smelled stale, like it hadn't been lived in for decades. It creaked under the weight of time and neglect. Mark's footsteps echoed through the silence, but he wasn't alone. He could feel it. The weight of something watching him from the shadows. The whispers began again, soft at first, but growing louder with each step. "You didn't leave me." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He spun around. There was nothing. Just empty rooms, decaying walls, and the oppressive sense that something was very, very wrong. Then, a cold chill passed over him. His vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, the figure was there. The same one. Tall, gaunt, with those hollow eyes staring straight into his soul. Its mouth didn't move, but the words were there. They filled the room, echoing in his mind, crawling through his veins. "You shouldn't have come back." Mark tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, unable to escape the figure's gaze. The whispers grew deafening, the air suffocating. The walls of the house seemed to close in on him, trapping him in the very place he had tried to flee. The figure stepped forward, closer, until it was mere inches from him. Its skeletal hand reached for his face, and Mark finally screamed. But no sound escaped his lips. The whispers drowned it out. The figure's cold fingers brushed his skin, and he felt a sudden, sharp pain, the kind that comes when your very soul is being torn from your body. And then there was nothing. When the police found Mark's car parked outside the house the next morning, they assumed he had taken his own life, though no evidence suggested it. They searched the house, but there was no trace of him. The house was empty once more, except for the faintest sound of whispers echoing from the walls. Lisa was never found, and neither was Mark, but those who lived near the house began to notice strange occurrences. Objects moving on their own, whispers on the wind, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The house still stands, abandoned, but its silence is no longer peaceful. There are rumors that the figure, the silent guest, waits for its next victim. And the whispers? They never stop. The house remained abandoned. No one dared enter. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones, warning newcomers to stay away. They whispered about Lisa and Mark, the ones who vanished without a trace. But some nights, when the wind was just right, you could hear it, the faintest murmur of voices coming from inside. The journalist. One evening, Michael Graves, a journalist with a penchant for uncovering urban legends, arrived at the house. He had heard the stories, people disappearing, the whispers, the shadows. It was nonsense, he told himself, just paranoia. He was here to prove that. Armed with a flashlight and a recorder, he stepped onto the rotting porch. The boards groaned under his weight, almost as if the house was reacting to his presence. He pushed open the door. It wasn't locked. It never was. Inside, the air was thick, stale, as if it had been undisturbed for years. His footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. He started recording. This is Michael Graves, investigating the so-called silent guest house. Locals believe it to be haunted. I intend to prove otherwise. His voice sounded strange in the silence, hollow. As he moved deeper into the house, the whispers started. Faint, almost imperceptible at first. Then, clearer. You shouldn't be here. Michael froze. The air around him dropped 10 degrees in an instant. He swung his flashlight toward the hallway, but there was nothing. Just darkness stretching beyond the beam. He forced a laugh. Good trick, he muttered, though his hands trembled slightly. The recorder crackled. Static. Then, a voice, Lisa's voice. You didn't leave me. Michael's breath hitched. He checked the device. It was impossible. He hadn't played any recordings. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, suffocating. And footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming from upstairs, Michael's journalistic curiosity fought against the primal fear gripping his chest. He forced himself forward, climbing the steps one by one. The air was heavier here, pressing against him like unseen hands. The hallway stretched before him, impossibly dark. Then he saw it. A door, slightly ajar. He reached out. The moment his fingers touched the wood, the door slammed shut. And the whisper became a scream. A cold hand clamped onto his wrist. He jerked back, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The hallway was now crawling with shadows, twisting, writhing, reaching for him. He ran. Stumbling down the stairs, he lunged for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into one voice. One awful, hollow, inhuman voice. You're staying? Michael screamed. The next morning, his car remained parked outside. The house was silent. The only sign of him was his recorder lying in the doorway. The last thing it captured. A whisper. You didn't leave me. Michael Graves was never seen again. The house remained untouched. Something changed. The silence inside wasn't just emptiness anymore. It was waiting. New tenants. Months later, Daniel and Erica moved into town, unaware of the house's dark history. The price was unbelievably low. They didn't question it. They needed a fresh start. The realtor hesitated as she handed them the keys. Don't let the silence get to you, she muttered, before walking away. Daniel laughed. Creepy old house, huh? Erica forced a smile. Just stories. The first night, the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Erica lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Then, footsteps. Soft, slow. She held her breath. Daniel? No answer. Footsteps stopped, right outside their door. A whisper slipped through the silence. You didn't leave me. Erica froze. Daniel shut up, his face pale. He grabbed the door and yanked it open. Nothing. Just the dark hallway. They didn't sleep the rest of the night. The shadows grew. Days passed. Doors creaked open on their own. Objects moved when no one was looking. Worst of all were the whispers. Always at 3:07 a.m. Always the same voice. You didn't leave me. One night, Erica found Daniel in the living room, staring at the wall, unblinking. "Daniel," she whispered. Didn't move. She touched his arm. He jerked violently, gasping as if coming up from deep water. "I saw him," he rasped. Erica's blood turned cold. "Oh," Daniel swallowed. The thing whispering. He turned slowly to her, his face unreadable. "It's not a ghost," he whispered. Erica's breath caught. What do you mean?" Daniel trembled. "It's waiting. The final night." At night, Erica woke up, alone. Daniel was gone. Whispering filled the room. She shot up, heart pounding. The bedroom door was open. Beyond it, the hallway was wrong, stretched, too dark, shifting unnaturally. Then, footsteps. Low, heavy. A shadow loomed in the doorway. Not Daniel. Not human. The figure moved toward her. The air turned thick, suffocating. A cold hand brushed her cheek. The whisper was now a breath against her ear. "You should have left." The room plunged into darkness. Next morning, the house was empty. Daniel and Erica were gone. The only thing left behind was a single recording device on the bedroom floor. When the police played it, they heard just one thing. A whisper. Soft, cold, endless. "You didn't leave me."